Die Übersetzung von Jans Stimme vom Deutschen ins Englische wurde mit einer KI erstellt.
The last time we were in Ukraine in February, we experienced something very, very strange. We had to cover our press labels on our protective vests for the first time, and the reason for that was that we were driving into Kherson, a city in the south of Ukraine, and we were told, please cover them up, tape over the press markings with duct tape so that you're not immediately identifiable as journalists. The reason was that Russians are now actively targeting journalists. And as I said, it was a very strange situation. It was also one of those moments where you really realize press freedom in war is something very, very relative. And press freedom is coming under increasing pressure, under attack, not only in war zones but also in Germany itself. What actually is press freedom? Why do we need it? And what does it look like in everyday life in Germany? What does it look like in a war zone? And above all, we also want to talk about the responsibility of the press, because press freedom is of course not a one-way street. It comes with a great deal of responsibility, and that is exactly what we want to talk about today. You often have situations where your image is being deliberately distorted, where there is simply a desire to prevent certain images from reaching the world, and that is in a way a form of censorship.
Du hast es ganz häufig, ne? Dass also einfach sozusagen dir dein Bild kaputt gemacht wird.
You often find that your work is, in a way, deliberately disrupted. Your image gets broken, so to speak. And that in itself is a form of censorship. And you see that quite often in everyday political life. Security personnel, for example, stepping in front of you, physically moving you away, blocking access, so that in practice your ability to do your job is restricted.
So, dass du halt tatsächlich in deiner Arbeit eingeschränkt bist.
That was an example from Germany by Reto Klar, a photographer with the Funke Media Group, with whom I've often been in war and crisis zones. He also pointed out that press freedom in Germany too is being restricted in certain situations, at least to some extent. And in fact, that's becoming more and more common everywhere. We're running into problems where press freedom is no longer an unlimited freedom. And to be honest, it never really was. That obviously creates major challenges for us as journalists. And still, we try to report independently, fairly, and as close to people as possible. That's the balancing act we have to manage. And how that works, or how we try to make it work, that's exactly what we want to talk about.
In Crisis Mode, the podcast from Conflict Zones with Jessen.
Welcome to In Crisis Mode. I'm Jessen, war and crisis reporter for the Funke Media Group. Press freedom is definitely not a luxury. It is in fact the foundation of enlightened and democratic societies, because press freedom is meant to ensure that people can form their opinions based on reliable, well-researched information. And that's why it is absolutely not a luxury, but something fundamentally essential for open and informed societies. Press freedom shapes, every single day, what we see, and also what remains hidden. A few days ago, I was in Berlin, where I was awarded the Press Freedom Prize 2026 by Germany's two major publishers' associations. It was a great honor for me, and I saw it as recognition not only of my work, but also of the work of many colleagues who are constantly out in the field. Two of those colleagues are Reto Klar and André Hirtz, both photographers with the Funke Media Group. You already heard Reto earlier. I often travel with both of them to war and crisis zones, whether in Israel, Syria, Ukraine, Afghanistan, or elsewhere. Today they're going to share their own perspectives, and I think this is a great opportunity for you to get to know them, the people who have accompanied me on many of the journeys I've talked about in this podcast. So I'm really glad they had the time and interest to be part of this. So, what does press freedom actually mean? Let's start with a practical definition from Reto's perspective as a photographer in the field.
Naja, Pressefreiheit bedeutet natürlich in erster Linie
Well, press freedom primarily means being able to say, write, and photograph what you personally consider important. Because when I'm on the ground somewhere, I'm essentially the eye, the first filter of information. And doing that without fear, and of course without censorship in the end. And without someone coming afterwards and saying, no, you're not allowed to do that.
Ohne Zensur natürlich am Ende des Tages, ne? Ohne dass im Nachhinein jemand kommt und sagt, nee, darfst du nicht. Ne?
Press freedom is definitely not an abstract concept, but something that is lived in everyday practice. Access, independence, protection from intimidation, and responsibility towards the people we report on. There was recently another edition of the Press Freedom Ranking by Reporters Without Borders. It's an organization that works globally to defend press freedom and publishes an annual ranking showing how it is developing around the world. This year, for the first time, more than half of all countries fell into the categories difficult or very serious. That is, of course, a sobering analysis, and it becomes even more striking when you see countries like Israel or the United States ranked so far down. Israel is at 116, the only democracy in the Middle East, and the US, often seen as the birthplace of modern democracy, is now at 64. Germany has also slipped in the ranking, currently at 14. That's still relatively strong, and I think we definitely can't complain here in Germany, although things are becoming more difficult. For example, colleagues in Eastern Germany working for the Thüringer Allgemeine now attend events involving the AfD or other right-wing groups with personal security. You can already feel that the climate is getting a bit harsher here as well, but overall, we are still in a comparatively good position. André adds another layer to this discussion, focusing on plurality and one's own editorial stance.
Ja, Pressefreiheit heißt für mich, frei arbeiten
For
zu
me,
können,
press freedom means being
selber
able to work
seine
independently,
eigenen
to form your own point of
Standpunkte
view,
finden,
and to allow other
Standpunkte
perspectives as
zuzulassen,
well.
die
It means accepting a
Pluralität von
plurality of
Meinungen
opinions,
zuzulassen
engaging in
und
debate
sich
and even
auch
friction,
zu reihen
and ultimately
und,
protecting
ja,
and respecting
Diversität
diversity.
einfach zu schützen und zu respektieren auch.
For me, it's very concrete. Sitting at a desk and judging or describing the world from a distance, that's difficult. Of course, you can do that to some extent by consulting experts and so on, but for me, the essential part is going out there, being on location, and speaking directly with people and those affected. In practical terms, when it comes to wars and crises, it means talking to people who are impacted by war, conflict, or disasters. And I consider that absolutely essential for our work, that we go out into the field. I actually said this as well at the Press Freedom Award ceremony, where I called on publishers to continue sending us out and to give us the resources to be on the ground, so we can understand situations firsthand rather than relying on secondary sources. But that also means naming the sources we get information from. It also means correcting mistakes, and it means taking a stance without falling for propaganda. However, and I've said this before, restrictions don't only begin when you have to tape over a press vest because you might otherwise be targeted by a Russian drone, or when colleagues in difficult countries are imprisoned for their reporting. At the Press Freedom Award ceremony, the publisher Jimmy Lai was also honored. He is currently in prison in China, originally from Hong Kong, and was jailed by the Chinese regime for his work. But press freedom doesn't have to be restricted that dramatically to be under pressure, in my view. You also feel it in everyday democratic life.
Naja, das kommt halt ja, glaube ich, immer drauf an, wie man jetzt sozusagen, oder wo die Presse, wo man meint, dass die Pressefreiheit anfängt. Das fängt ja teilweise schon, sag ich mal, auf Lokalterminen an, ne? Also, das irgendwie, sag ich mal,
Well, I think it always depends on where you actually draw the line, where you say press freedom begins. And in some cases, it starts much earlier than people might think, even at local events. For example, I had this experience just last week in Berlin when the Senator for Culture announced her resignation. Her assistants came in and immediately pushed the press aside and moved us behind a wall because they didn't want images circulating of the senator, so to speak, leaving the stage. So even there, images are being managed, constructed in a way that are not really free. I mean, it's a public institution, and there was no general photography ban. So in my view, that's already where restrictions begin. And then, of course, you and I have often been in areas where press freedom exists in principle, but where the work of journalists is still restricted for various reasons. Security concerns around military sites, for example. So in many situations, press freedom is quite frequently limited in practice.
Journalisten einschränken, ne, seien es Sicherheitsbedenken, militärische Anlagen und. Also, ja, also ich meine, man begegnet Presse sozusagen, oder sagen wir mal so, Pressefreiheit wird halt relativ häufig eingeschränkt.
So there are restrictions, especially in modern press offices within ministries, or in the same way at events involving actors or concerts. Photographers in particular are facing more and more limitations. There's a growing desire to control the images that are being taken of ministers, politicians, or public figures and celebrities, and that obviously doesn't make the job any easier for our colleagues working in photography. On the other hand, there are also rules that are there to protect lives. We experience that at the front line as well when we're out in forward areas. There too, the military imposes restrictions, but they often have clear reasons behind them.
In Deutschland gibt's natürlich von unterschiedlichen Gruppierungen von
So,
rechts oder
the way
von
press
links
freedom, or
natürlich,
photojournalistic work in
Anfeindungen
general,
oder
is
Angriffe,
restricted varies a lot.
Hände, die vor
In
die Kamera
Germany, of
gehalten
course,
werden,
there are hostilities and
Äußerungen,
attacks from different groups, whether from the
Lügenpresse
right or the
natürlich
left.
als,
People put their hands in
Kollege
front of
mit einer
cameras,
Kamera in der
shout
Hand
at you, or try to
war sehr
obstruct you
viel
in other ways.
plakativer,
And as a photographer,
sichtbar,
you're especially
als
visible.
jemand, der
You stand out
für die
much more with a
Presse
camera in your
arbeitet.
hand than someone who is
Im
just working
Ausland
for the press
gibt's
in another
natürlich
role.
Rahmenbedingungen
Abroad,
im Rahmen der
there are of
Akkreditierung
course
oder
different
auch im
frameworks,
militärischen
for example,
Kontext,
through accreditation systems
Einschränkungen
or in
der
military
Hinsicht,
contexts.
weil wir natürlich
There are
Zugang
restrictions because we are
zu
granted
Bereichen
access to
bekommen,
areas that are security
die
relevant or
sicherheitsrelevant
sensitive.
sind, sicherheitskritisch
In those
sind. Da
situations,
gilt's,
it's about protecting the safety
die
of the
Sicherheit
people
zu
being
schützen von
portrayed
den
as well as our
Protagonisten, die
own
man
safety.
abbildet,
For instance,
als auch die
images
eigene
can reveal
Sicherheit.
locations.
Also,
So,
zum Beispiel
those
Bilder
limitations are
kann
also
der
there to
Standort
prevent
verraten
that kind
werden.
of risk. I don't really see that as a restriction in a negative sense, but rather as a form of support, encouraging us to be more careful and sensitive in how we handle security and the protection of the people involved.
Protagonisten, die wir abbilden, denen wir eine Stimme geben, auch optisch zu gewährleisten.
Yeah, what André just described is of course always something that people debate about. Journalists also complain when militaries say, you can't just go to the front line on your own, you have to be accompanied by press officers, or you need special clearance and accreditation to go forward, and sometimes you even have to submit the images you've taken at the front. And yes, that is a restriction on press freedom, but at the same time, in my view, it is understandable. As André just outlined, if we take photos up front and there's a visible ridgeline or a tree line and those images are published, the opposing side might be able to identify where they were taken and then direct fire there. In the worst case, that can lead to people being killed, and that is obviously something you cannot take responsibility for. So in that sense, I think it is okay to have such rules. They just must not go too far. When you are out in the field, there are very different situations and regulations. For example, when you are embedded with the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, the restrictions are extremely strict. Military censorship is very pronounced. To this day, there is no independent access for journalists into Gaza. There have been guided tours by the Israeli military, but even there you cannot just freely take photographs or move around. You are completely embedded in an IDF vehicle, you cannot leave it, you cannot speak to Palestinians, and you are taken to specific locations where you are shown things like, look, this is a hole in the ground, or this is a tunnel. You can take pictures there and then you are taken back. From a journalistic point of view, that has no real value. We have been requesting independent access to the Gaza Strip for years, simply to be able to document what is happening or has happened there. So far, that has not been possible, and personally I find that very difficult. On the other hand, with the Ukrainian army there are also certain restrictions, as I mentioned earlier, such as having to submit images for review and having press officers present during conversations. But I've only experienced one case where something was actively blocked or I was asked not to publish something. That was a fairly intense situation. I had met a company commander who was clearly suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. In the conversation, I asked him what, in his view, needed to happen to end the war, and he said that the president should be shot, the parliament dissolved, and a military dictatorship installed. At that moment, it was clear to me that I could not publish that as it was, because I would be putting him in danger. Later, a press officer also asked me not to report it in that way, and especially not to quote him by name, because it would obviously get him into serious trouble, and I think that is completely fair. In general, as I said, guidelines are fine when they are there to protect lives. In that case, I would not consider them censorship. It becomes problematic when PR interests start blocking access or controlling images. And again, we also have ways of pushing back against such restrictions, if we choose to, legally, for example, and that does happen from time to time. But what we are seeing, not only in Germany but everywhere, is that this is increasing. Press offices are more and more trying to influence what is shown, especially in visual reporting. And then the question always comes up, what do we show and what don't we show? Of course, you can photograph almost everything, but some things simply won't appear in newspapers. Quite plainly, for example, we do not publish images of war dead because we do not want to violate the dignity of victims. and André brings it very precisely to the point as a photographer.
Ich glaube, Fotografie ist sehr häufig eher die Frage, was zeige ich nicht, als das, was ich zeige. Also ich glaube, in einer fotografischen Perspektive ist eher so die Frage.
I think photography is very often less about what you choose to show and more about what you choose not to show. From a photographic perspective, the real question is often, when do I not press the shutter? That can be for aesthetic reasons or for content-related reasons. Through our images, we create public awareness. We trigger wider debates. And images can also shift or influence political dynamics. And that means that with every press of the shutter button, you carry an enormous amount of responsibility in that very moment. And you have to be aware of that. For me, the key question is really, when do I press the shutter? Because we are showing these images to an audience, you also have to ask yourself, what is actually bearable to show? A lot of photography works through suggestion. It opens up space for interpretation, visually and conceptually. And I always find images most powerful when they imply things rather than trying to force themselves on you in a very blunt, explicit way. For me, capturing the quieter tones is far more interesting than showing a big, overwhelming bloodbath.
Die leisen Töne zu treffen, finde ich sehr viel spannender als jetzt das große Blutbad.
What André said naturally applies to print and audio in exactly the same way. When I write, I also have to make sure I respect certain red lines that I don't cross, especially when speaking to people in war zones. You often meet people in the most extreme, vulnerable moments of their lives. Very often people want to talk because shared pain can sometimes feel easier to carry, but then you also have to ask yourself, when do you become a voyeur? When does it turn into something like war pornography, if I can even put it that way? And when are you actually telling people stories in a dignified way? You simply can't push everything to its absolute limit. You have to make sure you respect those boundaries. And I think that is part of the responsibility of journalism, to always keep the dignity of the people we report on in mind, and to do everything possible not to violate it. Of course, that also includes checking facts and, as I said before, openly correcting mistakes when they happen. That is what maintains trust, especially in times of disinformation, which frankly is getting more and more extreme. When I was in Tel Aviv during the height of the conflict with Iran, there were numerous posts on my Facebook account claiming that power had already failed in Tel Aviv, that a power plant had been hit by Iranian strikes, that there were widespread riots, and that shelters were only open to Jewish people. There were claims of large-scale destruction in the city due to incoming strikes. These posts were often accompanied by images and videos, and it was all rubbish. It was AI-generated nonsense. And this kind of content is increasing massively, whether it's AI-generated images and videos, deep fakes, or simply written misinformation. These things get shared thousands of times because they match certain expectations or because people find them compelling, but very often it's simply lies, and as journalists we have to counter that by doing our job, by adhering to ethical standards, by checking facts, and by getting as close to the truth as possible. Because fully owning the truth, I think, is impossible. Truth is often also subjective, but our task is to get as close to it as we possibly can, and that's also one of the reasons why you have to go out into the field. As I said before, that's part of what drives me. But people also keep asking, why do you go into war zones? Why do you put yourself through that? And Reto describes it as a moment where the work becomes meaningful.
Naja, ich mache jetzt meinen Job seit 40 Jahren ungefähr und habe wirklich so verschiedenste Phasen in meiner Arbeitswelt durchlebt. Also
I've been doing this job for around 40 years now, and I've gone through very different phases in my professional life. Reportage work, portrait photography, all of that. I really enjoyed all of it tremendously. And then, a few years ago, I somehow had the chance to move into war reporting. And for the first time, I had the feeling that I was truly doing something meaningful. Meaningful in the sense that I felt I was doing something I absolutely had to communicate to people, to readers. That gave me a huge amount as well. But this feeling of purpose, of understanding the importance of your role, that was a completely different level of journalism for me. I mean, a nice portrait of Karl Lagerfeld, or the Chancellor, or whoever. It's all nice, it's enjoyable, it's satisfying. But this form of reporting, this kind of work, was something that, on a very personal level, gave me a deep sense of fulfillment. Probably more than any other assignment ever has.
diese Form von Berichterstattung, ja, das ist halt etwas, sage ich mal, was mich persönlich zutiefst befriedigt hat. Wahrscheinlich von der Aufgabe her so, wie mich keine andere Aufgabe irgendwie befriedigt hat.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. It's true that you're really out there doing this work, and of course it's not easy. When you're in a war zone, it's also dangerous. On top of that, you often work far more than you would in an office. Sometimes we're out there for 18 hours a day, and still it feels genuinely meaningful. Because what we're doing is helping people in Germany understand what war actually means, what catastrophes actually mean, what changes because of what is happening in Ukraine, in Israel, in Lebanon, in Afghanistan, or anywhere else, how it transforms people's everyday lives. And in that sense, war and disasters are no longer something abstract or sterile that you just write about from a distance. Instead, you can tell the story through the experiences and destinies of individuals and give wars, conflicts, and suffering a human face. And I think that is incredibly important, because only in that way, I believe, can we also counter lies and propaganda by focusing on the people affected by these crises and letting them speak for themselves. Sometimes it's also the small, quiet moments that stay with you, a sound from André that shows why empathy is such an essential part of our work.
Ich glaube, auch da ist das nicht der große Peng, glaube ich, den man erwarten würde. Ich glaube, das sind die kleinen Nebenszenen. Das sind eher in dieser Rauheit der Konflikte.
I don't think it's the big bang, the kind of dramatic moment people might expect. I think it's more the small side scenes. In the rawness of conflict, it's often the quiet, gentle moments that really catch you. For example, there was an assignment at a senior center in Ukraine that we visited. A lot of elderly people were staying there, people who had simply lost their homes and had sought safety there. And there was one woman who was offering yoga classes. Another one was simply talking about her rose garden. So there was this older woman who just spoke about it in such a simple way. And yes, that was incredibly moving.
Also da gab es eine ältere Dame, die einfach davon erzählt hat. Ja, das ist unglaublich berührend. Also, ja.
That is actually very true. You can still see that André is deeply affected by these encounters, or by that one specific encounter. And of course, when we're out there are always moments where you reach the end of words, moments where you might simply hold someone, where you cry together with them, especially when people have lost family members or loved ones. That's when you realize you can't push any further. And yes, that might be seen as unprofessional, or at least appear that way, when you break that social distance and just hold someone. But I think it's extremely important, because if you become emotionally completely numb to what you're witnessing out there, then you should stop doing this job. And if it goes too deep into your soul, then you also need to stop. We always try to find that balance. We reflect on it together as colleagues, and I think that's crucial. Empathy is definitely not a contradiction to professionalism. In my view, it is its foundation. I've also been to Afghanistan with André. He's been there twice with me. I regularly travel there with the Friedensdorf Initiative, reporting on the situation on the ground, which is extremely difficult. And in terms of press freedom, you can basically forget about it there. Local journalists have no real press freedom. It's more or less state messaging journalism. Criticism of the government there, the Taliban, is not tolerated. And yet colleagues still continue working on the ground. For us as reporters, it doesn't get any easier either. It's becoming increasingly difficult to obtain accreditation for work there. And yes, Afghanistan is an extreme case. But there are, of course, other countries where journalistic work is extremely difficult as well. Eritrea, Sudan, North Korea, and others. Still, it remains important to report from Afghanistan, even if it's not always about politics. People are simply suffering there. It's a country repeatedly struck by disasters, with a very fragile economic situation, and constant earthquakes, floods, droughts, and all kinds of crises. We've actually talked about this several times in the podcast already. I'll include some episodes for you in the show notes. And for André, that assignment in Afghanistan was also a very intense experience.
Das ist sehr unterschiedlich, aber ich glaube, ein Land, was an jeglichen Extremen kratzt, ist wirklich Afghanistan aus meiner Sicht. Die Abkopplung von der Welt, vom Weltgeschehen.
It's very different from place to place, but I think one country that really touches every extreme is Afghanistan, at least from my perspective. This sense of being cut off from the world, from global events. The geographical position, the suffering of people inside the country, the political situation, the feeling that nothing really functions. It's all very intense. Being so isolated in a country that is both politically and geographically cut off from the rest of the world is something very particular. You really do feel alone there. And it's not just a feeling of isolation. It's the sense that in a crisis, there is no external organization, no political institution, no authority that can actually come in and help you out. You are essentially on your own. And you're also dealing with local forces on the ground, including things like ISIS sleeper cells and similar threats.
Kräften vor Ort, mit IS-Schläferzellen, mit Co. umzugehen. Also das sind ja auch Konflikte, das sind ja keine symmetrischen Kriege, keine symmetrischen Konflikte, sondern das ist ja auch sehr undurchsichtig und ja, das ist unglaublich besonders.
So these are not symmetrical conflicts. These are asymmetric wars and situations that are often incredibly opaque, and that in itself is extremely unique. Press freedom, I think you can ultimately say, is fundamentally essential. Without press freedom, and without the freedom of the press to report on what it wants, to hold those in power accountable, but also to portray everyday life, there is no democratic formation of opinion. And that's why it's so important that we make sure press freedom does not come under further attack, including here in Germany. As I mentioned earlier, there are now cases in Eastern Germany where colleagues, even at newspapers within the Funke Media Group, require personal security when attending right-wing events. And honestly, that is just shocking, that something like that is happening in Germany. I hope that this remains an exception and that things move in a more positive direction. And when it comes to work in other countries, yes, we have to go out there. We absolutely need to go into these zones of conflict, crisis and disaster to show people in Germany what is actually happening, what it means for the people on the ground. Because all of these conflicts are not abstract political debates played out on some stage somewhere. They directly affect people's lives in very concrete ways. And that simply has to be shown. That's why I think it is so important that our publishers continue to send us out, give us the freedom to do our jobs, and that there are still readers who are interested in this kind of reporting. At the same time, it is equally important that we as journalists keep reflecting on our own role, stay aware of the enormous responsibility we carry, especially towards the people we report on in crisis and war zones, that we respect boundaries, protect human dignity, and constantly hold ourselves accountable. And when we make mistakes, we correct them openly so that we maintain the trust of our readers and audiences and do our job properly. This has been today's episode of our podcast In Crisis Mode. This podcast was produced by Alexander Baumeister, who is also a journalist working at the Funke Media Group's radio station. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and follow us. It really helps make our work more visible. Feel free to get in touch as well. And a big thank you to Reto, Klar and André Hirtz for their insights. If you have suggestions for future episodes, you can reach us at krisenmodus@funkemedien.de. Take care of yourselves. See you soon. All the best.
In Crisis Mode, the podcast from Conflict Zones with Jessen.
Ein Podcast von Funke.